Now, Peter, just to begin with, you suffered I think, fairly minor stroke not so long ago, but you seem to have made a complete recovery.
Well, I didn't recognise it as a stroke. I suppose you could call it a stroke. It's medically called a TIA. And don't ask me what that stands for now, I've forgotten again already. But it was a very minor incident, but it was a wake-up call. And I suppose if I said it frightened hell out of me, because the potential then to have a stroke or to have some other problems similar, but I've got through all that. That's all history now.
In what respect did it frighten you?
Well, as my doctor said to me one day, I suppose you're asking yourself, why me? And I said, funny you should say that, because I think, why me? I mean, my wife looks after me extremely well. You know, we're very careful with diet. She's very careful with diet, and I'm nearly as careful, and she certainly supervises most of the things that I eat and indulge in. So why me? You know, I've had a healthy life. I'm pretty fit. I'm not exactly a couch potato, although others would dispute that too, because I spend a lot of time watching the news in the evening. I try not to miss the 5 o'clock news, the 6 o'clock news, the 7 o'clock news, and the 7:30 report.
So what was the answer the doctor gave you? Why you?
I hate that word, but he said, you're getting older, Peter. I said, the last doctor I had said, it's because you're getting old, Peter, so I changed doctors. He actually retired, so I didn't change doctors at all, but Peter Beeston became my new doctor. And then the first thing he tells me, not the first thing he tells me, but it's not long before he tells me that I'm getting old. I'll soon be 80, and really, I've been everywhere and done everything I could conceivably think of. I have no fear of dying, but I absolutely don't want to be in hospital or a vegetative state. Being dependent upon my family, or my family having to care for me or be concerned about that, oh look, I don't want that.
Did your thinking go anywhere in particular off the back of this? Did you find your thoughts and your actions went in any particular direction?
No. I suppose my feelings were extremely hurt when the Department of Aviation decided that my licence would be suspended for the time being, and when I was told that I shouldn't drive for at least 3 months, I was devastated, especially not so much about the driving licence, because I knew that was a shorter period, but to tell me I couldn't fly, when really my life for the last 40 years has been about flying. I love flying. Life for me was always up in the aircraft, going somewhere or doing something, or just up there flying. I love flying. I love aeroplanes and I love flying. It did come as a bit of a shock. There would be no question about it. I've aged in the last 5 years. I've aged at an accelerated rate. If they'd asked me how old I felt 5 years ago, I would have said 50. And if you asked me today, I'd probably tell you that I look like I'll make the 80. So I feel as though I'm 80. Oh, you know, we'll make 80.
Is there anything that you're discovering that's positive about hitting 80?
No, not really.
Okay.
Oh, well, I guess a degree of disappointment, because my father was 95 or nearly 96. My mother was 92. So both of them lived to a ripe old age and relatively comfortably right up till they died. My mother went through a series of concerning sicknesses, and they kept giving her pills until she was on 12 pills a day. And one day she said, that's it, I've had a good life, Peter, and I don't want a bad one. Got all her pills that the doctor had carefully put out for her in daily doses, put them all down the toilet and pressed a button, and I would say the next day she looked a little bit better, and a few days later even better still, until she was pretty right. And then at 92 she got sick and died. And I couldn't say she sort of lay around dying for days, she just went to sleep and passed away. We had absolutely no money. Like, it was the wartime and things were tough. But we were self-sufficient. My father grew all the vegetables we need, and we used to kill a goat if we needed meat. We used to milk the cow. In fact, after school we had to go down to the paddock down the road about a mile, get on the cow, Clippy, and ride her home. You know, we'd hop on her back. Myself and my brother, older brother, would hop on her back and ride her home, and then we'd milk her. And next morning she'd go out to the paddock for the day.
Where was this nirvana of yours located?
In Norfolk, in East Anglia, northeast of London, 100 miles from London. And always historically been a fairly backward county in the sense that it was a little bit remote. You know, the other biggest cities all over England were well known and targeted by the Germans, but our capital city was Norwich, and I don't think the Germans even noticed it. And yet, in Norfolk, within 8 miles of us, we had 36 wartime airfields. Within a radius of 8 miles of our house, we had 8 airfields. You know, big places like West Pickering, Swanton Morley, West Raynham, Mildenhall is probably a little bit more than 8 miles away. Beeston, which was from my bedroom window, I could see the Beeston Aerodrome, and that was a bomber base. So we were very much, we were in a direct line between the rocket launchers in Europe and London. And as children we used to say, if the red light was on, that's okay. But if the red light had gone out and you could only hear the noise, then you had to dive for cover.
What did that mean?
Well, it didn't actually have a red light, of course. That was the exhaust pipe. It used to be glowing red. So if the red light was on, it was on its way to London. And if we had the noise, the whistle of the rockets and no red light, then it was going to be a hell of a big bang.
Were there any bombs going off anywhere near you?
There were a lot of things to do with the war, but no, a few aeroplanes crashed. There was a massive fire at the airbase just within a short distance of our house at Beeston, and I can't remember the circumstances of that now, but something hit the fuel tanks there and the whole lot went up, and a massive explosion and enormous fire that followed. But the war was there. We used to have regular visits by Air Force personnel who used to show us silhouettes of aircraft so we could recognise them. And we had to report. If we heard an aircraft, we had to try and identify it and let somebody know, if we could identify it, so that they could be forewarned, if you like, that they're on their way. So everybody was to be, in a sense, a spotter.
So there was a sense of adventure about the whole thing.
I guess you'd say that, yes. I mean, in some ways I was very young and well, my brothers and sister were quite young, so village life went on, and the war was in the background somewhere. My father worked over at one of the air bases as he ran the officers' mess there. He had previously been through the First World War, and with distinction actually, and I'm only just finding out this information now after a recent trip to London and searching the archives for his war record to see exactly some of the things he did do.
And what is memorable about what you found?
Well, he was awarded a medal for gallantry and demobbed from the French battlefields because of a gas attack, and almost immediately afterwards sent in behind the lines in France, apparently because of his fluent French. He had had a long experience with France and the French language, and so they gave him that job, and I'm told he was awarded, I think it's a Legion of Honor medal, but we can't locate that, and that's another story. We know where it is, or we know where it should be, but we haven't been able to find it yet.
But the record suggested he had that award.
Well, I went to the archives and I found the award for his service. He was with the Scottish Rifles, the old Cameronians, and between when he enlisted in 1903 and in 1915 or 16, I'm vague about that date at the moment, but he was I think demobilised, or whatever, they discharged from the military, and that's when he was sent over to France.
So did your dad ever talk to you about his experiences in the First World War?
Never, ever once. Not once did he mention war, except he hated the thought of war. He was often quite outspoken about wars. I should tell you that my father was a socialist, and he was quite a serious socialist, as was one of my brothers, whereas I'm, on the contrary, well known as a right-wing political person.
Beyond that, what sort of a father was he to you?
Well, he was good, but I think it's worth noting that when I was born, he was 56, and that's a big age. That's quite, even by today's standards, that's quite old to be having children. And I've got two younger brothers, so he was 58 when John was born and 60 when Robert was born. And when I went back to England, well, 72 when I left England, and when I went back 9 years later, then he would have been 81. And I remember distinctly that when I left England, he was sort of larger than life, forced to be reckoned with, you might say, even when he didn't have the horsewhip. But when I went back, I looked down from the side of the ship to see him on the wharf there in Southampton, and there he was. And I thought he was a midget. I thought he had shrunk. Of course, he had shrunk to a degree with age. I suppose 9 years is significant. But my view of him was, oh, goodness me, what happened here? He was on the Norfolk County Council, and he attended religiously to meetings and always inevitably took me with him if I could get away from school, like it wasn't a school day. And so the respect he had for doing a bit for the local authority. And so all my life I've elected to do that. In Papua New Guinea I spent 10 years on the local government council, 4 years on the provincial government. I was nominated by the local council to be their representative on the provincial government. And I stood for election for the national government, but history will show that I failed in that one. And the bloke that beat me, Pius Winkty, became the Prime Minister. I suppose I got that respect because people used to call on us at the house. And that's a bit unusual to go and venture into somebody else's territory in village life, you know. And so they would come and arrive and say, "Is the governor home?" And that was that's a common English expression, old English expression, you know, the sort of people they looked up to in the village with the governor.
And what would they have looked up to about your dad?
I suppose the fact that he would represent them in the council if they had a problem with the council or the law. They would go and ask him for advice or get him to represent them, perhaps. Although he didn't have those sort of qualifications, he was an accountant by profession, but I think that's probably, they respected what he was or how he behaved, I guess would be the answer.
Well, he sounds like a strong person.
I think he was pretty strong. He could wield that horsewhip. We had to work, you know, we all had to work. And we kept a lot of animals, and in European climate, you know, they're pretty closely confined in wintertime. Deep litter, they call it. You know, they don't leave their yards, pens or stables. And so they had to be cleaned out on a daily basis. And then you had deep litter, where they're sort of cleaned out on a seasonal basis. So every day you put fresh straw down on top of the old straw until by the end of the winter, the manure would be, or the soiled straw would be anything from half a metre deep to more. And that was our job to clean that out, of course. And no doubt I frequently protested or didn't turn up because I was out on my horses, because our life was horses. We were out exercising horses or riding to hounds or cub hunting in the winter and fox hunting in the spring. And the few very memorable things in my life was with Elizabeth and Margaret when they were princesses. I think they would have been 24 and 22. I think they were 2 years apart. And I went hunting with them at Raynham Hall, which is a local, very well recognised home of a family in Norfolk.
It sounds like tremendous fun, I must say.
Oh, we loved it, yeah. Well, I was really enthusiastic too, and because I was a very keen horse person, you know, I was right in there. In fact, my brother tells me that he heard the master of foxhounds saying to me one day, "For God's sake, Howard, get out of my pocket," because I was right on his heels, you know, virtually taking over his job. But it was fun.
At what age was that?
Oh, 14, I suppose.
You know, you have a joy of life, yeah?
Oh, I think so.
Now, did you get that from your mum or your dad, do you think?
That's a hard question too, because they married late. And both had incredible experiences in their lives even before they married. My father had been previously married. His first wife died when she was 43. She went to North Africa to live with some dogs and came back with some disease, and they were never able to cure it. And she subsequently passed away at 43. She had one daughter, who would be my half-sister, with whom I've had absolutely no contact until just recently. What just went through my mind then? How I should have paid more attention to my half-sister. She never married, so she lived alone. She's extremely eccentric. I hope she doesn't hear this, but extremely eccentric, but extremely talented, you know, very well educated. And she's 10 years older than me. She's now, just turned 89. But it's just amazing. She had great experiences, and I suppose I've missed out in the sense that I wasn't able to have seen that sort of life she had.
Was she not with you as a child?
No, never. No, I didn't even know of her until I was 40.
Well, after her mother died, where did she go?
To her relations, her grandparents.
Why would your father have not kept her?
I think because he, at the time, had already formed a relationship with my mother.
Okay. And that's how they did things in those days?
That's how they did things, and geographically a long way apart. And travelling across England in those days was no easier then than it is now. They gave us my mother and father gave me a very good life, there's no doubt about that, because we had the horses which we loved so much. And we had a lot of friends who looked after me very well, especially, and to a degree my brother, taking us to shows and things like that. They had more facilities, like they had a horse track, and I was often chosen to ride their ponies. I mean, like a lot of horse people, they can't actually ride them themselves, but they groom them and brush them and prepare them and maybe breed them, and then they need someone to ride them to give them their best opportunity. And we used to make horse rugs from the ribbons we used to win. It was a good life. Like a summer in England would be doing the Gymkhana circuit around Norfolk. And Norfolk has a series of very attractive little villages around the coastline, and they might have 2 or 3 a week. So we would leave home and attend to a Gymkhana on a Wednesday, maybe a Friday or a Saturday or a Sunday, or maybe a Friday, and then go to the next village for the village show in that village, this competition or Gymkhana.
Who would be with you on these expeditions?
Often my mother, but generally speaking, a lady from the next village, I guess, Bessie Carter. We had a pony there that her daughter, Maisie, used to ride, and then I would ride it, and then my brother John would ride it, and this one would compete. So he took the whole lot of us through all the events at the Gymkhana. So if it was for ages, a rider from up to 10 years old, probably John to get the job, and if it's 10 to 12, then I'd get the job, and if it was 12 to whatever, Maisie would get the job, or my sister. I was in Norfolk recently and went to the Aylsham show, and when I arrived there I spoke to a guy there who had some sort of authority there, and I said, you know, the last time here was at the Aylsham show was in 1949. And I won the junior show jumping here, and my sister won the senior show jumping here at the Aylsham show. By coincidence, the show jumping was on that afternoon, and the girl that won it was a Howard also. She was a FitzAlan Howard, you know, the Duke of Norfolk's granddaughter. So it was pretty exciting trip down memory lane.
Did you suffer any injuries as a kid?
Not once, never.
Never fell off a horse?
I couldn't say that. one day I was out riding between Milam, the village where we lived, and Litcham, the village where I subsequently went to school. I was riding my pony along the road there, and next thing, there were low jet flying exercises and a plane went over. And when I say low, I felt the heat of the bloody exhaust from that plane. Anyway, of course the horse jumped out of his skin and I went clean over onto my head, and of course I got that scar on the top of my head today from where I landed. I left school and there was no alternative or debate. You went straight to work. You didn't go to work, you're going to starve. So I left school. I was 3 weeks short of my 14th, so I was 14. 3 weeks short of my 15th birthday, and I would have finished school on the Friday and gone to work on the Saturday morning, and full time on Monday onwards. At this farm I went to work on, the Williamson family owned, and they got a tractor. Well, of course, all the old farmers said, "Oh, I'm not driving that thing." And so I became a tractor driver. And in fact, I claimed to be the head tractor driver because they had two farms, and if it had to be moved from one farm to the other farm, I was the one that had to do it. Because not only were they not very keen to drive the tractor, they certainly weren't going to go out on the road on it. And so I used to go herring around the roads, the lanes around Norfolk to get to the other property, deliver the tractor for them. Norfolk, I emphasise, was very much in the boondocks. You know, it was the hinterland. It was the rather long way from London and big city life. And even today, there's no motorway to Norwich. There's a motorway to Cambridge. There's a motorway to every other big city in England. There are even motorways linking city to city. They don't all come from London, and yet to Norwich, you have to go down a single lane. You get behind a truck that's just arrived from Europe, and they frequently do because they come into Harwich and Suffolk and then drive through to Norwich that way. Get behind a truck, you dawdle along there at about 30 miles an hour when you want to be doing 60.
Yeah, you're really a boy from the country, aren't you?
Absolutely. When I had my interview in Sydney to go to Papua New Guinea, the advertisement said, must have farming experience. And during that interview, he said, "Do you have any farming experience?" I said, "I was born on a farm." He said, "I didn't ask you where you were born. I asked you if you had any farming experience." Well, even then I was only 20. So I don't know what experience he expected me to have of farming when I was 20, but of course I did have some experience. I was familiar with animals. The job didn't have to have a description. It wasn't part of the job description to be able to handle animals because we were going to be running coconuts and cocoa trees.
But coming back to your first job when you left school, first of all, how did you go at school?
No good at all. Dumb. I suppose I was cunning because I remember we had one particularly, he was a very nice school teacher, Bob Petch, and he used to tell us stories of his exploits during the war. And so, and he did geography. Now, if he was going to give us a geography lesson, and most of the class weren't that keen, we used to debate who would actually ask him to tell us the story about the time he parachuted out over Germany and got stuck in a tree. So whoever got nominated would say, "Excuse me, Mr. Petch, before we start the lesson, do you mind just telling us that story again about the time when you got shot down?" That'll take care of the geography class. The bell would go and out we'd go.
Did you have any idea as a kid what you wanted to do with yourself?
Absolutely not, none. My father wanted me to be, he suggested I should consider being an apprentice to the Philips Electrical Company. It was a Dutch company, as you probably know, which was moved by the British holus from Holland to England at the outbreak of the war. So they brought all their technical people over to England to develop things. So it was a big company in England by then, but its origins were in Europe. And he saw television coming and thought that I should maybe get involved in electronics. I was more interested in the pretty brochures we had on Australia, New Zealand and Canada. And I did actually consider going to Canada at one stage. Always thought Australia looked great, but then we had friends who had come and stayed with us after the war on their way to New Zealand. They were to migrate. This is a couple with a young daughter. They were going to migrate to New Zealand. I knew nobody in Canada and at that point nobody in Australia at all. And so New Zealand to me, he became the target, at least a stepping stone, the first step, because at least somebody was the other end.
At what age did you make that decision?
I guess I left when I was 16, and there was a bit of a delay with my departure because we had to have an X-ray. We had to be absolutely clear of any health problems, and they said there was a shadow on my lungs, which turned out to be rubbish because 3 months later I had another X-ray and there was nothing. So my departure was delayed by about 4 or 5 months. So we had nothing, so I left with nothing. I had a suitcase with a change of clothes in.
So when you went and sat down and said to your dad, I've decided I'm going to leave England, leave you, leave the family and go to New Zealand, what was his reaction?
I think it was positive. And he took me to London for my final trip out of England. I went up with him to London by train, and we stayed that night in London, which was really the first time I'd ever stayed outside Norfolk in my life. First time I'd ever lived or slept anywhere except at home. Apart from the odd occasion, one of these gymkhanas, we might have slept with the horses and washed our faces in the horse trough the next morning and got back in the saddle. Because that was our life.
Do you recall that he said anything in particular to you when you left?
No, I don't.
Do you recall?
I really don't. He probably would have. Do you imagine I was 16 years old and this big ship, and it looked like a big ship, you know, it wasn't that big really, by today's standards. We boarded this big ship.
What was it called?
The Rangitani. The Rangitani. It was a New Zealand ship. We went out of Tilbury, which is on the Thames up in London, just south of the city centre of London. So down the Thames, out into the Channel, and the next stop was a little island in the West Indies where we refuelled, a Dutch island there, Antigua. Refuelled then through the Panama Canal. Imagine how exciting it was for a 16-year-old to be sailing through the Panama Canal. Monkeys swinging from trees to trees and bananas everywhere and things I'd never seen before. Avocados. Never even heard of an avocado. I don't think anybody in Britain had ever heard of an avocado in 1950.
But it's an incredibly gutsy decision for a 16-year-old to make.
Well, I look back and think so too, but it never occurred to me at the time that I suppose really that I wanted to do anything else.
It spoke of straight away of an entrepreneurial spirit, didn't it?
I suppose. Working on a dairy farm in New Zealand, it was pretty cold in New Zealand. Yeah, that was pretty tough too, and that was fairly well paid. I think we earned £2 New Zealand pounds a month. £2 a month I think I got there, but I got my keep, so they fed me. So Australia was looking for migrants, no question about that. And they did beautiful brochures, you know, wheat fields as far as the eye could see. We were farmers and we grew wheat around our place, and they were little paddocks of 10 acres and 15 acres, and here's one of 10,000 acres of wheat, and beautiful photography. I thought, oh heavens, look at that. And then pictures of New Zealand. New Zealand's a very beautiful place. It's a beautiful place now, and it was a beautiful place then, and we'd get from our friends, the Summers, who had gone on to New Zealand before me, always sent back a calendar each year. And I might just say that each year for the following 40 years after I left New Zealand, Joan sent me a calendar of New Zealand. Always these pretty pictures of New Zealand, which is a very photographic place, photogenic, photographic place.
Before we talk more about New Zealand, if you had an opportunity to yourself thank your mother for what she contributed, what would you say to her?
Oh, I think I made it pretty plain to her always how grateful we were of the upbringing we had and the opportunity to get away. And she came to visit me in Papua New Guinea, and she came to my wedding in Papua New Guinea.
But what would you thank her for in terms of your childhood?
I guess that'd have to be the horses, because she was the equestrian in the family. I never saw my father on a horse, but she loved horses and she competed. She would never miss a fox hunt, never failed to take me to a show or to ride in a show. She was an equestrian, amongst other things.
Was she an affectionate mother?
I guess she looked after us pretty well, affectionate. There were 4 of us, 3 of us very close together, so I suppose probably she was. I guess she certainly provided us for us very well under very difficult circumstances. Yeah, the war was all around us, and those years we were still on ration. When I left England, we were still rationing some things. I think sugar was one of them. I don't remember what the other things were now, but you had to carry the ration book when you went to the local store to get anything, and if you had rations you got some, and if you didn't have rations you didn't get any. And in a discussion with my mother not long before she died, I said I thought she was pretty harsh with the allocation of eggs. You know, at breakfast we'd get 1 egg twice a week. We had a pen full of chooks. How come we only got 1 egg a day twice a week? You know, surely I could have eaten 2 every day. But we grew our own eggs, but we also had to provide an income. So most of the stuff that they grew and bred and reared was to survive, not only for our own consumption, but generally to survive, for income.
So there weren't too many mobile phones for the kids?
No, no mobile phones for the kids. In fact, no toys. The only toys we had, and the only my father made, and I only remember distinctly one Christmas where he made this fairly elaborate train set out of wood. And we played with that for hours, but otherwise we didn't have toys. Probably in the later years we had Meccano sets. And it's a pity we don't see Meccano sets everywhere now, because they were very good, they were terrific. You could build all sorts of things with Meccano. Now they use Lego blocks, which seems to be the easy way out.
What did you learn out of your experience in New Zealand?
I suppose that's when I first became interested in rugby, because they're all rugby fanatics over there. And I supported the local team, Waikato. They're called the Chiefs. They had a shield, a rugby shield game that went on every year. They had Ranfurly Shield, and we tried very hard not to miss any of those games. But don't forget, I was a dairy farmer, which meant that I could only see the first half of the game. Then we had to leave, go home at half time, milk the cows. The cows wouldn't wait. And the game usually went from 3 till 5, and the cows had to be milked at 4. Well, at least we had to be well on the way home by 4 to get to milk the cows. Once again, I fitted into the community very easily there, very well. Got into lots of mischief.
Oh, tell me something about that.
Well, I lived in a little village called Pupu initially, and then moved to the local town Tikawiti. Tikawiti is right under the geographic centre of the North Island, in an area called the King Country. It's called the King Country because the Maori King made a deal with the Queen Victoria that there would be no alcohol could come into that area. That rang of an opportunity. So we used to go up to the last pub for 120 miles was a place called Kiki, a little village north of Tikawiti. So if you slipped up there and got a carload of booze, you could come down when there was a ding-on in Tikawiti and you could flog it out the back door there. Well, it wasn't long before a bloke with a long and heavy torch came along and said, "What's going on here?" Nice chap really, because he gave me the opportunity of going to prison or going to Australia. I took the latter option. I said, "Oh, well, I'm going to leave." I've been thinking about going to Australia because the Olympic Games were looming. They were in 1956, and there's a lot of talk about how exciting that would be for Australia and New Zealand, and I saw that as probably a lot of opportunity arising there with the enthusiasm around the Games. And so I think the reason he was so unhappy was that probably didn't offer him a drink, but the real reason was that only the week before my friend and I had been out on the booze, and on the way home we came across a horse on the roadside, so we hopped on the horse and rode it home and then let it go. Well, he said he wouldn't charge me with horse stealing, but he thought the least I could have done was either found the owner or put it in a paddock somewhere instead of just letting it loose on the road. I think getting caught the following week flogging grog at the back of the dance hall was probably the straw that broke the camel's back. And consequently, a fortnight later I was on a ship. I had to resign where I was working.
But had you enjoyed the life of a dairy farmer?
It was a good, healthy life, but it was tough. You know, it was up every morning at 4:30 to milk the cows, and every afternoon at half-time at the football, on the weekends anyway, half-time at football going to milk the cows. Otherwise, they had to be milked every afternoon, and you can't take a day off.
What sort of pay did you get?
£2 a month, and my keep.
Did you save it?
Well, I must have, because I have a recollection now of having £30 in the bank when I left New Zealand after 3 years. I'd saved £30. So I was fairly well cared for in all my other needs, I think.
Were there any people there who in particular were kind to you, influenced you, taught you something?
Yeah, I think the couple I went to work for when I first got to New Zealand, Max and Athleen Hodson, they were very kind to me. I was taken in as family. Our family friends, the Summers, were about 5 miles away, also on a small dairy farm. And 5 miles in a straight line, because you'd walk up and down hill, over the hills to get there. And on weekends I'd often finish cleaning up the cows on the weekend, the dairy on the weekend, and walk over to their place. So about 5 miles, and that was through some very primitive Maori settlement there. So I was always a little bit nervous on that walk.
Any reason to be?
No, probably not. Except they were like aliens to me, you know. I mean, different nowadays. I mean, my attitude now, if I went to Papua New Guinea, would be to walk through the middle of the village because I feel an affinity with these people. But those days, you know, they might as well have come from the moon.
The trip to Australia then, what was, was that on board a vessel?
Yeah, the Wanganella.
Wanganella.
Motor vessel Wanganella.
Where did you actually land in Australia? What was your touchdown point?
Sydney.
Okay.
Walked down the gangplank in Sydney, Darling Harbour.
With 30 quid in your pocket?
With 30 quid.
And that's after you'd paid your fare across?
Yes, I forget what that was. I think that was £6, which was an awful lot of money there. I mean, that was at least 3 or 4 months' pay, just to pay the 3 months' pay probably. Pay the ticket. I've got that ticket somewhere.
What was your plan once you got to Sydney?
I think my attitude was the same as everybody else's in those days. You went out and got a job, and if you didn't get a job, you went hungry. And I got a job very quickly. I think the first 2 days, I went out to meatworks at Homebush, and it was daily. You went to work in the morning, got paid in the afternoon. So the job never lasted more than a day, but I went out 2 days in a row.
Where were you staying?
That was a Thursday and a Friday, I think. I was staying in a boarding house in Redmire Road, Strathfield. Number 8 Redmire Road, Strathfield. It's a boarding house that backed onto a girls' school in Strathfield. And there was a murder in that school that week. Anyway, it wasn't long before the police came round to check all us guys in the boarding house because well, I was a recent arrival and because of this incident. I remember that very distinctly. But I only stayed in Strathfield a very short time because the destination really was Bondi Beach. If you came from New Zealand to Australia, you went to Bondi Beach. And for many years that was the case. And Bondi crawled with New Zealanders. That's where they went. Bondi were close by so they could go to Bondi Beach. In those days, when you lay on the Bondi Beach, and you don't see it nearly as much nowadays, there was barely room to lay a towel out full width. You might get full length if you're lucky, but you couldn't lie a towel out. It was so crowded with people, and you may have seen pictures of Bondi Beach. I saw one on television last night. A Bondi Beach taken, you know, it's like 50 or 60 years ago. And there were people lying literally hand to hand right across the beach.
So you out at Homebush and working in the abattoirs, that's a skill, that's a particular skill, right? You've got to know how to wield a knife and...
No, it wasn't that job. The job I had was collecting up meat hooks and tipping them into a boiling cauldron to sterilise them, I think. So I'd go along the meat floor picking up these hooks in a barrow, wheel them back to this hole in the floor which had boiling water in it, and tip them out. And I did that for a couple of days, and I thought, yeah, there's got to be something else to do than this. And I got a job in the local service station there. They said a guy was going on holidays for 2 weeks, and would I be available for 2 weeks? And I said, sure, nothing else planned at this point. So I went and worked there, filling petrol and washing cars. And at the end of the 2 weeks, the guy came back, and they said, look, we don't want you to go. We'd like you to stay on here. And I thought to myself, well, you know, got to be more to life than this, washing cars and filling them up with petrol. And I answered this advertisement. Oh, no, I went to work in a fish shop in Phillip Street in the city. Now, that was a good experience because it was run by 2 Greeks. They had a problem. They insisted on brawling all day, fighting and arguing and swearing and chasing each other with knives. And here I am trying to wash the oyster bottles and putting bottle today and the new day's date on, same oysters, new day's date on the bottle. Sell them to the customers that day.
Poisoned a few people, did you?
I don't know, I hope not. I certainly hope not, but that's what I had to do.
How were you managing to get through and stay out of trouble all this time? You know, I mean, actually you got into trouble in New Zealand, I got that, but you know, I sensed that there were no confrontations, no really big events that scared you and things like that?
No. Certainly not in Australia, no.
How do you think you managed that?
Well, I wasn't very long in Australia. You know, I was 19 when I landed, and 20 when I left to go to Papua New Guinea. So I was basically only a year. But in that year, I never spent 1 minute sitting on my butt. I walked all over the city, or took the tram to the extremities and walked back, or even today, I can drive through Sydney blindfolded. I know Sydney like the back of my hand, and yet I've never really lived there since 1957. But I know Sydney. I know where they are, and I can think in terms of that suburbs over there. I mean, I loved it so much. It's such a beautiful city.
Well, how could you be dragged away from something you love so much?
Well, that's a good question too. I saw the I ran into a bloke in the pub, young guy just come back from Port Moresby, and he was telling me about Papua New Guinea, and then I saw an advertisement in the paper looking for plantation assistants. That was the advertisement. We were assistant managers. I applied for the job, and the guy interviewed me. I hate to think I've forgotten his name now. Very nice chap though. And we had the interview, and except for the minor hiccup when he asked me what I knew about farming, I told him I was born on a farm, but he gave me the job. And so I went back to my boss in Bridge Street, and they gave me the best reference you could imagine, saying that I was going to explore Papua New Guinea, or going on a venture to Papua New Guinea, and that if they didn't work out, then I'd have a position there. I came back. We can't get a better reference than that. And all the advice I got from the fellow that interviewed me was that I should take a shave every morning before I went online. And online was lining the labourers up at 6 a.m. or daylight. And daylight's the same every day up there because you're nearly on the equator. So it's a few minutes either way of 6 o'clock in the morning. You made line. Never go online without having a shave, Peter. And take plenty of vegetable seeds with you and plant them as soon as you get there. It was interesting when I got there because I went straight to Rabaul. And Rabaul was, you know, that was the focal point. That was the headquarters of the Japanese. In the plantation I went to, there were 100,000 Japanese centred around that area. And this plantation had been planted by the Germans in the turn of the century. And the Japanese had come, and they needed to grow rice to support all these people. They couldn't rely on supplies from around the world or from Japan. And so they'd taken out 2 lines of every 3 were removed of the coconut palms, cut down and removed to grow dry rice to feed this massive army they had in the Pacific. And my job was just to replace those coconuts and interplant the coconuts with cocoa trees. And yeah, as you imagine the experience here, I'm In fact, I came in late one afternoon after checking the copper dryers and turned the news on. It was just coming up to 7 o'clock. And they said it's the 7 o'clock on the 16th of July, 1957. Oh, geez, that rings a bell. Hang on, it's my birthday. I was 21 that day. It's my 21st birthday, in fact. And I thought, oh dear, I can't just sit here. I hopped in the car and drove into the local club, and I get there and there's the barman and two blokes there. That was it. The town was dead. It must have been midweek, and had a couple of drinks and went back home again, back to work.
But you were perfectly happy with all of that, were you?
Sure, yeah. It was a big plantation, 2,500 acres, 1,000 hectares, and the next door neighbour was another one, Rallabang, at 1,000 hectares.
This is Taboona.
Taboona, yeah.
And what sort of an influence on you did Ian Purvis turn out to be?
Well, he left not long after I got there to go and get married in Australia. A big step for him because he was, I'm guessing now, 30-something and hadn't married. And he went off and got married. And so I was there with the assistant Dick Koeman, a young Dutchman. But I had a great deal of respect for Purvis, just the way he did business. You know, he taught me lots of things. And so did Koeman to a degree, but Koeman was a bad influence on me in a sense that he was extremely tough for the local people. And he stressed that you didn't fraternise with them, whatever. You kept them always at arm's length, always tough, always hard decisions, no flexibility, and I did that while I was there. And look back, I think I could have done better. And so he was a bad influence.
So it wasn't a natural thing for you to be tough and hard?
Definitely not. Purvis was pretty tough, but then he was the manager and said no nonsense. But the important thing was to be fair, always fair and reasonable, and always listen. You know, if they got a problem, hear it out. Don't jump to conclusions that it's anything too onerous or too severe, or listen to them. And even if you say no, they have respect for the fact that you actually took the time to listen.
Peter, you're at the Cavalo plantation and this fella Clayton comes along. What was the disagreement about?
I was actually at Marengus plantation at that point. Yeah, that was the second posting out there. What was he on about?
Yeah.
Well, he was doing his job. If I had been him and he was me, I would have sacked me. And that's what he did. I'd been 5 years on that island, and you've heard of people becoming troppo. I was troppo in the sense that very laid back. You know, every Saturday and Sunday out water skiing. We were, you know, very keen water skiers out there. Or drinking, and in many cases both. The island was pretty unique. It was 50 miles in circumference. I have a couple of records there. One is for the biggest crash in history on my motorbike. And the other one was for water skiing around the island and non-stop, 50 miles. I tell you, that's a long way. I was very keen on water skiing, really keen, and I guess I got pretty good at it because my friend of mine, Frank Faulkner, and I went over to Port Moresby to compete against the Papuans. They thought they were pretty good, so we'd go over there and give them a flogging. I was wrong again. They beat us hands down. They were better at it in the rough seas, and we always had the benefit on Kaka that if one side of the island was rough, the other side was smooth. So we always skied when it was nice and comfortable, and really enjoyed our skiing. Whereas Moresby Harbour is often quite rough.
No issues with crocs?
No crocodiles on Kaka. Well, they have been seen. They've arrived there and left when they've been off course. But no, it's not a crocodile problem.
What happened when you crashed the motorbike?
That was a long story too. I was heading towards a party and I was arriving late, so I was moving fairly fast. And I came across a big creek. There's a flash flood creek, so they're actually dry. But when they flood 20 foot deep in raging water. and then an hour later they'll be dry again or empty. But it had a large log bridge across this thing, and unbeknown to me, they had removed the deck of the bridge. I think they were replacing the bridge and they'd put new cross members. And so I come over the crest of this hill doing an excessive speed, and I'm faced with this 4 pieces of timber across the river and no decking. Yeah, got halfway across. When I arrived at the party, I recovered myself from my motorbike and got back on the motorbike and arrived at the party, and by then, of course, I was blood from head to foot. But the party was on the Saturday night, and on the Sunday we were going for this boat ride out to Bagabag Island, an airby island where the fishing was fabulous. And so they dressed me up in what was the equivalent of mercurochrome. I think it was gentian violet or iodine, and bathed all my wounds and filled me up with an anaesthetic made by South Pacific Breweries, and off we went. But that was a spectacular crash and a spectacular fall from good health to critically wounded.
At what point did you start to make the transition from party boy having fun to, okay, let's get a bit serious here?
That was last week. No, in Kaka, you see, the longer you stayed in the tropics, they were long terms. My first term up there was for 3 years, 36 months, and in the end I stayed more than 40 months before I got leave, before they could relieve me, you see, and I went to England then. That was in 1960. So that was a long time without a break. You know, the government only did 21 months, and we in private enterprise, or most of us, had to do 3 years, and then got 3 months holiday after 3 years. I got to London, I became quite sick with some tropical disease, probably, well, I'm not sure what it was, but I went to the St Swithin's Hospital in London to be checked out there. Eventually I recovered. Fairly quickly I recovered, really, but I was quite sick. And so they extended my holiday and I was away more than 4 months.
What took you back to the UK?
My family there. I hadn't seen my family for 9 years. I left, I was 16 when I left and 25 when I went back. So
this is when you had the experience of seeing your father much older, was it?
Much older, well, by 9 years older than when I left, but seeing in a different perspective altogether, from being, if you like, a very predominant, dominating, not dominating, but you know, larger than life character. A person to be recognised, and then I come back on this ship and I see him over 80 years old, had come down from home to pick me up off the ship. And just that first impression was that he was miniature.
Did he give you a hug?
I can't recall exactly, but yeah, he was certainly genuinely pleased to see me, no doubt about that. And we drove home and talked on the way about what he was quite fascinated with, where I was and what I did, and probably a little surprised, although he didn't say that.
What was the highlight for you, looking back now, of that trip you made to the UK?
Well, without being unfair to the family, I met up with some friends in London and I bought a car, and the 5 of us headed off across Europe and crisscrossed Europe, basically from youth hostel to youth hostel, as you did in those days. So right up to Denmark, and then Denmark to Poland, and then through East Berlin through East Germany to East Berlin, and then West Berlin through the gate, Brandenburg Gate. Pretty significant, you know. It was all sort of, if you like, seeing where the war, because East Berlin at that time was still total devastation. The streets were filled with rubble except for a few main arteries. The streets were still full of rubble, all the buildings on the ground. Went through the Brandenburg Gate and there was West Berlin, you know, modern city, new buildings, fast cars, and you know, it was booming along, and the other side in a time warp. And that was before the war. So I was there in 1960. I think the war was built in 62. Might have been 61, soon afterwards anyway. And I had a British passport, but it was fortunate because everybody else got grilled at the Brandenburg Gate by the British passports, because we controlled West Berlin then. That was the Americans' the British and the Russians controlled West Berlin. And
What
not
passport were you carrying at that stage?
British passport.
Still a British. Okay. All right. Yeah. And so were you already committed to going back to PNG at this stage?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, well, I'd finished my first contract and was ready to go back for another 3 years and back to Kaka Island. Kaka Island is hard to describe. It's what everybody would have to imagine as paradise. You know, it was 50 miles in circumference, 5,000 feet high, so it had a nice big volcano right at the top, a very active volcano at times too. Lush and fertile. You could grow anything on Kaka. There were 13 plantations, 40 expatriates and 12,000 local people. A road right around the island, but only a grass track maintained by the local people. Those days in Papua New Guinea, Monday was road day, and on Monday everybody had to be out on the road doing maintenance. There were no questions. Monday morning was road day, and so all the roads in Papua New Guinea were run the same way. The KIAP, or patrol officer in charge of that area, would organise road day. And so they built roads and maintained roads beautifully. But they were only just, you know, glorified tracks really. And beautifully cut grass, like a lawn. You could play tennis on it, except that they tend to walk in a straight line for a period, then bend a little bit and walk straight and then bend back and so on, for different reasons, probably water lying on the road or whatever. And when you're on a motorbike, you try to follow the walking track. It's quite spectacular sometimes. But every now and again, especially coming home at dark after a long weekend at a neighbour's plantation, you might come face to face with a pig. And when you hit a pig, it's like hitting Gibraltar. You know, the motorbike stops almost instantly, the pig is killed, and you end up about 20 metres up the road.
And this literally happened to you, did it?
Oh, several times. When you look at my legs, the old burn marks down each side of my legs from the exhaust pipe, you get stuck in a drain with a motorbike on top of you, and a red hot exhaust tends to leave its mark.
As you're going through your time in PNG, you know, it seems you went from party boy to serious businessman at some point, maybe gradually.
Well, I guess Kaka, there wasn't much else to do except go around and have a few drinks with the neighbours. I played tennis, so we played quite a bit of tennis. Water skied extensively. I built 2 boats while I was on Kaka. I was there for 5 years with the company, and during that time I built 2 boats. The first one was hardly a speedboat, but it was a very good little fishing smack, and the second one was a very good speedboat. And when I came to leave Kaka, after I got the sack and I had to change my lifestyle completely, water skiing went out the back door, and there was a guy who was been transferred to a plantation over on New Britain Island, and he needed a boat, and he had a car. How convenient is that? So he took my boat and I took his car, and somebody put it on an aeroplane and took it up to the Highlands, because there was no road to the Highlands then. It was just there was a goat track. It was barely a walking track for the full length of the road. That came later, and so everything was flown in and out of the Highlands. But getting back to Kaka, the 13 plantations, 3 of them belonged to the Middleton family, Jim and Anna Middleton. Sorry, John and Anna Middleton, not to be confused with Jim and Anna Middleton, very close friends of ours. Both remain very close friends of ours. John is still on Kaka with his wife and 2 boys. They run these plantations. They have done since 1922, I think, when John's father took them over from the Expropriation Board. That was after the Germans had been defeated and kicked out of the Pacific. The plantations were resumed by the Expropriation Board and then distributed to lucky applicants.
Take me through the events that occurred around you hitting this local bloke and killing him, and what transpired.
Well, this was some years later, of course. I was driving with my my first wife, Molly, driving into town. That was to be my first day on the local council, on the Western Highlands Council. That was to be my first day at a council meeting, so it would have been 8 o'clock in the morning, and I'm driving. The children left home with a babysitter. Molly and I are driving towards town. two guys walking down the side of the road on the right-hand side, and just at the last minute, one of them decided to run across to the left. Well, my choices are very limited. It was a gravel road, and I hit the bloke on my left then. He was on the left side by then, and probably quite hard. I didn't run over him or anything like that, but just nudged him with the thing, but it broke his femur. So I stopped the car, opened the boot, picked him up and put him in the boot and took him into the hospital. Opened the boot, couldn't get any help there in a hurry, so I opened the boot, picked him up and carried him in, put him on the operating table in the theatre, and I said, this guy is wounded, he's been hit by a car, needs some attention, can I leave him with you? And they said, you can't leave him here, you can't leave him here. But I said, look, he's badly hurt and needs instant attention. And I went off to my council meeting. And while he was breathing deeply, he was still okay, I thought. Meeting started at 8 o'clock. I went through the meeting, and at 12 o'clock we're just about to adjourn for lunch, and a fella comes up and puts his hand on my shoulder and says, Peter, that fella you hit this morning is dead. And you've heard the expression, your blood ran cold. My blood ran cold. Primarily for him. He was dead. But also I knew the potential ramifications of such an incident. Anyway, I was confident I could handle it because I had no feeling of guilt at all. It couldn't be avoided, it was an accident. And went to the coffee shop and had some lunch and a cup of coffee, and I walked out of the coffee shop and there they were. About 6, maybe 2 or 3 others were there, but hangers-on. So 6 fairly aggressive chaps said, did you run over a pig this morning? I said, no. And made some other comment. And I realised then that this was like D-Day. So I pulled the keys out of the car and I threw them as far as I could, because I thought at least they don't put me in the car and take me out of town. And the assault began, and they bashed me fairly severely with stones, and then they had a big lump of concrete, and they were just about to drop it on my head when this lady came out of the shop just to my left, I think she was carrying a purse and waving a purse and saying, get out of it, or words to that effect, and which stopped them dropping that rock on my head. And a moment later another big guy who was Polish, I remember, but I can't think of his name, he came out of the coffee shop and he scattered them because he was a big bodybuilding bloke, powerful character. And they dispersed, and they got the ambulance and took me off to hospital. So I was fairly badly wounded, but certainly badly bruised, extremely badly bruised, but otherwise not really hurt. Fortunately the concrete didn't drop on my head.
Was that going to kill you?
Oh, almost certainly it would have been the end, because it was a large lump of concrete, which they'd found somewhere. And the description I get later is that they were in that position when she came out with her handbag, waving it around. But, somebody had died. I was in hospital for about 5 to 6 days, I think, but the bruises lasted for 6 or 8 months. I had these purple and brown patches all over me from these bruises, so they got into me, no doubt about that.
How did you sort that all out?
Well, payback, which is the custom. It's accepted. If there's been a major incident concerning one group, then it has to be satisfied by the other group, or whoever caused this trauma. I heard they were looking for compensation. I should say I had to go to court. The police came and interviewed me and said, you better tell me what happened. I explained exactly what happened. They said, look, we're going to have to charge you with manslaughter. So the police issued a summons and told me to appear in court, which I did. And the magistrate was the father of the present Prime Minister, Brian O'Neill, father of the present Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea. And they heard all the evidence, called up the witnesses, and that was a bit of a charade. But I had a lawyer. He'd been a policeman himself, and later became a barrister. anyway, the meeting went on for a couple of days, and then I was discharged. There was no evidence of my doing anything to contribute to the accident. And the primary witness, fortunately for me, the primary witness was the bloke in the school bus behind me. He'd been following me. He told the court, following me for 2 or 3 miles, taking the kids to school. And so when I pulled up and picked this guy up and put him in the boot of my car, he'd stopped the bus and was watching me. Well, fortunately, his evidence made it very easy for the judge to come to a conclusion. But still, the matter of payback. It's the custom. That's the reality of life. Not a question of going to court and being cleared and going home. There was no from the point of view of the villagers, there was no satisfaction there. And there's always the threat. Nobody actually said to me, "We are going to kill you." I mean, they'd made that attempt, but nobody actually said to me that we are going to kill you, but they did say about the compensation. So I negotiated with them on a deal, and I set it up to be in the centre of town because I didn't want to be any remote areas when this took place. Supervised by, when I say supervised, the police stood about 100 metres away, watching through binoculars. There were a couple of patrol officers there watching the whole procedure. I think they accepted that I had control of the situation, that compensation had been sought and I was going to pay. The controversy in the newspapers that week before and for several weeks afterwards was incredible. The interpretation many people put on it. One bloke described, they said, now it just shows that the white men are just another tribe because we'd reverted to local custom. That wasn't the way I saw it. Just a year before I'd bought these plantations and borrowed the money. I borrowed 100% of the money, an enormous amount of money by today's standards. By standards then, compared to today, maybe not so much, but an enormous amount of money. And I owed that money, so I wasn't going anywhere. I certainly wasn't going to leave for Australia. So I arranged a date and time and an amount, and we met on the hill right in the middle of town, right in the centre of Hagen. And there was some discussion, at which time I reminded them that I expected some compensation myself. I said, because I had been injured and that the court had determined that I hadn't made any, hadn't been culpable. And what about compensation for me? And there was a lengthy debate and discussion in the local dialect. And eventually they offered me a pig. I think they offered me several pigs, but I said, oh no, look, you can give me a pig and that'll square the deal. So I paid them the money.
What did you pay them?
I think it was $4,000, was it, in shillings? It was all in shillings anyway, because everything, trading, buying coffee was all in shillings in those days. 10 cents, if you like. And it might have been shillings, come to think of it. It was after I can show you some of the paperwork, but it was after the changeover of currency. And a truckload of cattle, some beautiful cattle, which I took out the abattoirs for them. I had to truck them in and then truck them out the abattoirs for them, and they took delivery of them out there. But they were happy with that. As far as they were concerned, justice had been done. It's not a question of fault. It's a question of the scales balancing. I don't think ultimately they never blamed me for his death. They were upset, and why wouldn't they be upset? Anybody else had run over one of the minions in the village, but I ran over the chief. That wasn't a good idea.
Oh, the chief, it was the chief you hit?
Well, he was a senior member of that clan. And anyway.
Okay, so at what point during your journey, your time, your adventure in Papua New Guinea did Molly come along?
It would have been 1969. Mm-hmm. She was a nurse at the hospital. And we had a fairly intense romance for a year. And then she got pregnant and we decided to get married. She never accepted that I loved her, and I did. It was a very, very happy time leading up to the wedding, and then at the wedding, and that was an event in itself, and then for a short while afterwards. But then it seemed to deteriorate quite dramatically. We had the twins coming. They were their firstborn with the 2 boys. And then 15 months later, Anne Louise, my daughter, came along. So 3 under 15 months. She was born in Brisbane, the boys were born in Perth. They were severely damaged at birth. We can't identify exactly what happened, except that I took her into the hospital, and it was 2 days later when they gave her a cesarean section. And nobody should be in labour for 2 days. Everybody knows that, except obviously that doctor, because he didn't appear the first day. And when I finally just jumped up and down and insisted on a cesarean section, I think it was too late. But in the back of my mind, I've always wondered whether it was Debendox, which is the nausea pill you took for what do they call it when you get sick in pregnancy.
Yeah.
So with Debendox did cause the trouble or not? I don't know, but those boys unfortunately have suffered a fairly severe handicap.
Okay. To this day.
To this day.
Which is a matter of some sadness for you, clearly.
Very much so, because they have great personalities. They're very smart, but they can never drive a car. They have problems with concentration and emotion and being tactile. You know, they're not sort of able to do lots of things.
Do you think it was that event, perhaps, that created a real wedge between you and Molly?
I don't know. I was anchored. I owed all that money, and there was no way I was going to run away from that. And the boys had to go to Perth. They couldn't be cared for adequately up there. And so we bought a house in Perth. Probably one of the better decisions I made in my life. I bought a house for $8,000. It was a nice house, quite a nice house too. Old and wooden. But an American had been living out here and he had borrowed $8,000 to buy this house and then gone back to America. So the bank didn't care much as long as they got their money back. And I said, oh, I'll give you the $8,000. And we did the deal within about a week.
Where in Perth is it?
In Perth, yeah.
Whereabouts?
Number 13 Howard Parade.
In Perth City?
In Perth City, yeah.
Wow.
Or in a city, Salter Point, actually, overlooking the Canning River. Okay. That was cheap even then. Nowadays, of course, Lord knows. Well, soon after, Molly moved with the children to Perth, and then later she came back briefly, but was unsettled and left.
And you say that she never believed that you loved her. What was that all about, do you think?
Well, I don't know, but I was 32, and I had never had. She was my first, really my first relationship of any. You know, I mean, I'd been out with girls and gone to dances, but the first relationship I'd had was with Molly, and we got on pretty well together, and things were pretty. Oh, I don't know how to interpret all that.
So it still troubles you somewhat?
To a degree. But of course in the meantime I'd met Anne. And Anne, as you probably worked out, is considerably younger than me. So I suppose there was a degree of fascination initially. And then we became very good friends and became very close and then got married.